The room smelled like old paper and cold. Light. Velsoren liked it that way. He had worked in the Bureau of SciFi classification for 31 years, and in 31 years he had learned that the best thinking happened in rooms that didn't try too hard. No windows, no decorations, just data and the hum of machines and the quiet certainty that everything in the universe could be understood if you looked at it long enough. He pulled up the file on his screen. Earth, third planet from a yellow star, one moon, mostly water. The atmosphere was breathable, which was always the first thing he checked. He had cataloged 62 species in his career. 41 of them breathed something that would dissolve a person from the inside. He appreciated the ones that didn't. He read through the initial survey data. His assistant, Myra Eth, had compiled it. Over the previous 6 months, she was young, barely out of her training cycle. And she did good work, thorough, careful, the kind of work that didn't need to be checked twice. He trusted her in the way you trust a tool that has never broken. The species was called human. He read the word again. Humans. It was a strange sound, round and a little soft. Nothing about the sound suggested anything dangerous. He liked that. The species he'd cataloged with the most frightening names had all turned out to be large, slow creatures that ate plants and startled easily. He began reading. Bipedal, bilaterally symmetrical, average height between 1.5 and 1.9 m. Lifespan of 70 to 90 years, which was short, almost aggressively short, the way a candle is short. Compared to a star, they were warm-blooded, which the quorum had learned meant emotional. All warm-blooded species were emotional. It was something about the way heat worked inside a body. He suspected. He had no real evidence for this. It was just a thing he believed. He kept reading. Humans had language, many languages, actually over 6,000 of them, which was not unusual for a species that had evolved in isolated populations across a large planet. They had art, music, paintings, sculptures, things they built purely because they were beautiful and not because they were useful. This was always a good sign. Species that made useless beautiful things were, in Velsoren's experience, the ones worth talking to. They had religion. Dozens of religions, hundreds if you counted the smaller ones. This was also not unusual. They had war. He slowed down here. This was the part of any planetary assessment that required care. War was not automatically alarming. Almost every intelligent species had gone through a period of organized violence, tribes against tribes, nations against nations, the messy early era of any civilization finding its edges. The Aerith had done it. The Velkai had done it. Even the Quorum's founding species, the Lorenthi, had a period in their history so violent that they simply didn't teach it in schools anymore. War was a phase. That was the official position, and in 62 cataloged species, the data supported it. You grew up, you found better solutions, you stopped. He noted the human wars in his report and moved on. The civilizational markers were good. They had nuclear energy. They had global communication networks. They had reached their own moon and left footprints on it that were still there. They were not yet capable of interstellar travel, but they were building in that direction, the way a child stacks blocks without knowing the word for architecture. Velsoren sat back in his chair and thought about what kind of species this was. Emotional, creative, short-lived, and therefore probably in a hurry, curious the moon. Footprints told him that you didn't go to your moon unless something in you needed to know what was there. He liked curious species. They were the best kind. He began writing his assessment. The human species presents as a mid-development civilization in the late conflict phase of their social evolution. Their aggression appears to be culturally produced in context, dependent rather than biologically fixed, given sufficient external stability and positive diplomatic contact. Their intergroup violence is expected to self-correct over several generations. They show strong markers for creative intelligence, social bonding, and technological adaptability. Recommendation: first contact full quorum membership offer. He read it back. It was good, accurate, clean, the kind of assessment that would sail through review without a single question. He sent it. Myra Eth was at her desk in the smaller room attached to Velsoren's office when the file submission notification came through. She saw it and felt the small familiar pang of a report she wasn't finished thinking about. She pulled up her own copy of the Earth data. She was not disputing Velsoren's conclusions. She wasn't the kind of person who disputed her superior's conclusions, partly because she respected him and partly because she was still new enough to believe that experience was almost always smarter than instinct. But there was a section in the biological survey that she kept coming back to: the human shoulder joint. She had flagged it the first time she read the structural data. She had a degree in comparative xenobiology, and she had studied the musculoskeletal systems of 43 species, and she had never seen a shoulder joint quite like a human's. It had an extraordinary range of motion. It could rotate in ways that most species joints couldn't manage. The muscles around it were dense and layered in a very specific configuration. She pulled up the kinetic analysis. The joint was optimized, and she used that word carefully because optimization implied purpose for one particular motion above all others. Throwing the human shoulder was by a significant margin the most efficient throwing mechanism she had ever seen in a bipedal species. It wasn't close. The nearest comparable species could throw a projectile at roughly half the speed and a quarter of the accuracy. She stared at this for a while. Throwing by itself was not alarming. Lots of species threw things: food, nesting materials, objects they wanted to move from one place to another. It was a useful motion, but she went looking for context. What had humans thrown, when, for how long? Archaeological data was old, very old. She went back 2 million years and found evidence of throwing, not objects tossed carelessly, but times aimed times throws, calculated throws, the kind of throws you made when something was trying to get away from you or coming toward you with bad intentions. 2 million years. She wrote up a short addendum to the data file. Not a challenge to Velsoren's report, just a flag, a Times look at this Times attached to the shoulder joint analysis. The throwing data, a few secondary notes about human pain tolerance and reflex speed that she'd noticed in passing. She submitted it to the general file. Then she went to lunch and thought about other things. Quorum Council Chamber was the largest room on the station, which was the largest station in the known galaxy, which told you something about how the quorum thought about itself. Velsoren had presented in this room before. He was not nervous. 31 years of doing a thing correctly had burned the nervousness out of him. He presented his findings on humanity. The council was 7 species, 14 representatives, all of them older than Velsorin, most of them carrying the specific kind of calm that came from having seen everything. Twice they listened, they asked questions that were good questions, the kind that sounded simple but weren't. How advanced is their space travel capability? Not interstellar yet. Could they reach other systems within a generation, possibly 2? Are they aware of us? No confirmed evidence. Are they dangerous? Velsorin answered this one the way he always answered it. Every intelligent species had the capacity for danger. That was almost a definition of intelligence. The question was whether that capacity was expressed through violence or channeled into something else. Humans were still channeling a portion of it into violence, but their trajectory was positive. The council voted the contact vessel would be prepared and dispatched to the Sol system within the quarter, a standard diplomatic package, peaceful broadcast, translation protocols, an offer of dialogue if the humans responded well. The process of quorum membership could begin. If they responded poorly, meaning with aggression, the vessel would withdraw and a longer observation period would follow. Nobody expected aggression. Not really. Species capable of building global communication networks were almost always capable of choosing conversation over conflict when someone offered them the option in a language they could understand. The meeting ended. Velsorin walked back to his office through corridors that hummed with the quiet business of an organization that had been right about almost everything. For 400 years, he almost didn't notice the addendum file attached clears throat to his submitted report. He almost dismissed it without reading. It was small, a footnote from his junior analyst, and he had a dozen other assessments to begin, but something made him open it. The words times shoulder, joint kinetic analysis throwing, optimization times caught his eye in a way he didn't quite understand. He read it again. The throwing data sat in his chest in an odd way. He couldn't say why exactly. He was not a military man. He did not think in terms of weapons and threat assessment. But something about the phrase times 2,000,000 years of throwing at prey times made him pause in a way that Myra Eth's careful, non-alarmist language was not designed to cause. He pulled up the full biological file. He read the sections he had skimmed. Pain tolerance high, significantly above average for warm-blooded bipedal species. The human nervous system was capable of filtering out levels of physical pain that would cause most species to stop functioning. Not permanently. It wasn't that they couldn't feel pain. They could. They just kept moving anyway. Cortisol response, the human stress hormone system, behaved in a way that was technically a defect in any other species. Under extreme threat, the kind of threat that would shut most organisms down, the kind that triggered freezing or collapse, the human cortisol system spiked and then cleared rapidly. What should have been overwhelming became fuel. They called it in their own literature adrenaline. He read the word several times. He had no equivalent in Arith. He closed the file. He opened it. He sat in his quiet room that smelled like old paper and cold light and looked at the data for a long time. Then he opened a new document and began writing a secondary internal note that he marked as Non-urgent, personal research not for submission. He wrote one-line query at what point in evolutionary history did human aggression cease to be a cultural product and become something older? He saved it went home. On Earth the night before the Quorum's contact vessel crossed into the solar system, a woman in a city called Nairobi sat at a desk and looked at radar data that didn't make sense. The object was too large for a satellite, too slow for a meteor, too perfectly angled for either. She called her supervisor. Her supervisor called her supervisor. Within 4 hours, the information had moved through 17 layers of government in 6 countries. By morning, people who made decisions for a living were in rooms with maps and screens, and the specific quiet expression of someone who already knows the situation has no easy answer. Not one of them assumed the object was friendly. The Quorum sensors recorded the pattern of human response. 17 separate governments, 6 hours. Military postures adjusted. Communication protocols activated. Defense systems quietly moved to elevated readiness. The data was flagged by a Quorum analyst and sent to Vel Soren's office. It sat in his inbox, unopened, filed automatically under immature civilizational phase expected. The translator was a piece of software, and like most pieces of software, it had opinions it didn't know it had. It had been built by Quorum linguists over 2 years, fed every piece of intercepted human communication they could gather. News broadcasts, radio signals, the long, tangled web of something called the Internet, which contained more information than the Quorum's analysts had expected, and also significantly more arguments about food than anyone had prepared for. The software was very good at translating human words. It was not good at translating what human words times meant, and so when the Quorum's diplomatic vessel broadcast its message of peace into Earth's communication networks, a careful 12-point statement of goodwill, fellowship, and the hope for mutual understanding, what arrived in 17 government translation centers was something that sounded in several languages, not entirely unlike a very polite ultimatum. The word that caused the problem was Arith in origin. Velineth, it meant in Arith something close to times we extend ourselves toward you in hope. It was one of the warmest words in the Arith language. Poets used it. It appeared in wedding ceremonies. The software translated it as times we reach for you. In English, Mandarin, Russian, Arabic, and 4 other languages, we reach for you, times sounded like something you said right before you grabbed someone by the collar. 17 governments read the message. 15 of them went to elevated defense posture without anyone ordering them to. It happened the way breathing happens, without thought, without decision, just the body doing what the body knows. The Quorum's diplomatic team on the contact vessel was a group of 6, led by Ambassador Taurus Vel, who had 30 years of first contact experience and had never once failed to establish peaceful dialogue within the first 72 hours. She was the best in her field. Her record was perfect. She was about to meet the one variable her experience had no category for. The human representative arrived on the vessel 12 hours after first contact. They had sent a shuttle, which was impressive because the humans had not been expected to have anything capable of reaching the Quorum vessel for at least another decade. The shuttle looked like it had been assembled from parts of 3 different machines held together. with something Taurus Vel's engineers described as times alarming times and then declined to elaborate on. Human's name was Commander Daniel Osai. He was a compact man, medium height, with the kind of face that didn't change much regardless of what was happening around it. He walked onto the quorum vessel looking the way a person looks when they are entering a room they have already decided they own. Taurus Vel greeted him warmly. He greeted her back. The translator software, running in real time, managed the first 20 minutes of conversation adequately. Greetings. Names, the careful circular opening. Moves of a diplomatic meeting where both sides are deciding how honest to be. Then Commander Osai asked a question. The message you broadcast, the word you used, Velinath, what did you mean by it? Taurus Vel explained. She was precise and clear. She meant goodwill, hope. An opening of hands. Osai looked at her for a moment. And if we had said no, if we had told you we didn't want contact, Taurus Vel said, and she meant it genuinely, as an honest answer, that the quorum would have respected that decision and withdrawn to observe from a distance until humanity was ready. Os said, withdrawn to observe. Come. He said it again. Withdrawn to observe. Taurus Vel wasn't sure why he was repeating it. Osai leaned forward slightly. His voice stayed exactly the same. So you've been watching us. For how long? Taurus Vel told him. Room was quiet in a way that felt different from regular quiet. Osai said very calmly, and in that time did you see any indication that we wanted to be watched? Taurus Vel began to answer. She had a good answer, a reasonable answer, about passive observation being standard quorum protocol for any pre-contact civilization designed to protect. Osa said, you watched us without our knowledge or consent for 6 years, and then you send us a message that sounded like a threat, and now you want to offer us membership in your organization. It was not a question. I need you, he said, to help me understand why I should not treat that as an act. Taurus Vel had never been asked that question before in 30 years. She found she didn't have an answer ready. The question had a shape that her diplomatic training hadn't cut a space for. She reached for her best language. The translator software did what it always did. What she said was, we did not intend any harm to your people. What arrived in Osai's earpiece was something closer to, your people were not the target. The talks collapsed in 4 hours. There were other failures, smaller ones piling on top of each other the way small failures do until they add up to something large. A misread gesture, a silence that one side meant as respect and the other read as contempt. Osai was not an unreasonable man, and Taurus Vel was not a dishonest diplomat, but they were operating with a broken tool between them, and neither of them knew it. Os left. The shuttle went back. The quorum vessel waited. On the station the news arrived at Fleet Commander Davith Oran's desk. Within the hour. Oran was not a diplomat. He did not pretend to understand diplomacy. What he understood was geometry, the geometry of fleets, of engagement, ranges, of how much force it took to make a decision clear and final. He had 400 years of quorum years, had produced a situation that couldn't be resolved through sufficient application of that geometry. He looked at the failed talks report. He looked at the human military response data, the elevated postures, the activated defense systems, the way 17 governments had snapped to readiness. Within 6 hours of the first broadcast, he thought about the geometry, remove the threat architecture before it. Matures, he told the council. 1. Demonstration, their moon nothing. Inhabited, we hit a surface point and we make clear that further aggression on their part, any further posturing, any defense preparations will be met with force they cannot match. The council approved it. The math was clean. It had always worked before. The strike hit the lunar surface at 3:47 Greenwich Mean Time. The explosion was visible from Earth with the naked eye, a bloom of light on the dark portion of the moon's face, there and then not leaving a crater the size of a small city where there had been gray rock and old dust. The quorum sensors watched Earth. They expected panic, broadcasts, emergency, government signals, the chaotic noise of a civilization that had just understood its position in the universe. They got 22 hours of silence, not the silence of a species paralyzed by fear, not the silence of governments unable to coordinate. The quorum's communication intercepts were running. They could see traffic, enormous volumes of it, encrypted, purposeful. 22 hours of a species talking very fast and very quietly about something they didn't want anyone to hear. Iran was not concerned. This was normal. This was a species doing the math, arriving at the only reasonable conclusion, preparing to make contact and negotiate from a position of acknowledged weakness. The silence would break. There would be a message, an offer of terms. He was prepared to be reasonable. What broke the silence was not a message, it was a ship. The quorum's picket vessels registered at first to contact, small, moving at a speed that shouldn't have been possible for human technology, not faster than light, not quite, but close. Close in a way that made the quorum engineers on duty look at their instruments twice and then look at each other. The ship punched through the picket line, not aggressively. It didn't fire, didn't maneuver evasively. It simply went through, the way something goes through a gap because the gap is there. It stopped in front of the diplomatic vessel. It was carrying no weapons. The scans were definitive on this point. No weapons, no shielding beyond minimal hull integrity, no crew of any size that could constitute a military threat. It was carrying one human. He asked in broken Arith that was painful to listen to but perfectly understandable. To be taken to whoever was in charge. Taris Vel, who had not slept in 20 hours, watched him come aboard on the security feed. He walked through the airlock the same way Asi had walked through the diplomatic room, like a person who had already made a decision and was now simply following it to its end. She noticed his hands. They were still. She had met many people under pressure in 30 years, diplomats, military men, heads of state, under pressure. People moved, they shifted their weight, checked their hands, adjusted their clothing, did the small physical things that bodies do when they're trying to manage what's happening inside them. This man's hands were still. She put that away somewhere in her mind, in a corner she would not examine for several weeks. She went to meet him in his office. Velsorin was reading Myra Eth's shoulder joint report. Again, he had read it 6 times in the past 3 days. Each time he put it down, he found himself thinking about it. Within the hour, he had opened a new research thread. He had not told anyone about it. It was officially personal reading on his off hours, which was not unusual for people in his field. Xenobiologists read constantly. Nobody would look twice. He was reading human military history, not the modern history, the wars his report had noted and filed. He was reading the old history, the very old history, the archaeological record of human conflict before the first written word. The weapons came first. That was the part he kept returning to. In the human archaeological record, the weapons were always first, before settled agriculture, before permanent shelter, before pottery, before written language, before any of the things the quorum used as markers of civilizational development. The weapons were already there. He didn't know what to do with this. It didn't change his assessment. Species' early history wasn't necessarily its destiny. The Arith's early history was full of things they were not proud of and had entirely grown past. History was not fate, but he kept reading. He was still reading when the alert came through that a single human ship had breached the quorum picket line and was requesting direct contact with quorum command. He stopped reading. He pulled up the live feed. He watched the human walk aboard the diplomatic vessel with still hands and already decided eyes. Something moved in Velsorin's chest, a feeling without a name, not fear. He was not a man who feared easily. Something older than fear. The instinct a person gets when they are looking at something they have not yet understood, but some part of them already recognizes. He pulled Myra Ev's report up on the same screen. He read the line about the shoulder joint again. He looked at the human on the feed. He thought about throwing, about what you throw things at, about 2 million years of practice. Then Oran's response to the human's request came through on the command channel. The answer was no. The human would be returned to his vessel. The strike on the moon had been the demonstration. The next communication from Earth should be a formal request for terms. Oran issued the order on the feed. Velsorin watched the human receive the news, watched his face, watched those still hands. Then nothing in the man's expression changed. He simply nodded once, turned, and walked back to his ship. Velsorin watched him go. Then he opened a new file. Emergency research allocation request. Studies on human evolutionary history, psychological stress responses, and prelinguistic conflict behavior. He marked it times urgent. The approval came back in 6 minutes. Routine, unremarkable, the kind of thing that happened 20 times a day in a large scientific institution. Nobody thought anything of it. Oran, meanwhile, was already composing the invasion order. 4,000 ships against 40. He had the numbers in front of him. The way a man holds a winning hand, with the quiet, total confidence of someone who knows the outcome before the game is finished. The math was clean. It had always worked before. The first 11 days of the war went exactly as the models predicted. This was, in retrospect, the most dangerous thing that happened. The Quorum's fleet moved through the outer solar system with the kind of precision that 4 centuries of military practice produces. Formation-tight targeting, clean communication protocols running without a single error. They were a machine that had been built and tested and refined over hundreds of years, and it showed. Every engagement was over minutes. Human ships, small, fast, and badly outgunned, broke apart under quorum fire like things that had never been designed to survive a real fight. The numbers came in and they were good. Numbers: 41 human vessels destroyed, 11 quorum ships damaged, none lost. The engagement reports read like practice. Exercises tidy and conclusive. The analysts who compiled them did not sound worried. They sounded the way people sound when the thing they expected to be difficult turns out to be easy. On day 12 something changed. Nobody noticed it immediately. The change was small. A human tactical unit that should have engaged from the front came instead from below the ecliptic, a vector that made no strategic sense by conventional doctrine, except that the quorum sensor array had a minor blind spot at that angle which the humans should not have known about. The attack was not effective. The human ships were still outgunned, and the exchange still went badly for them, but they had come from the blind spot. The analyst who wrote up the report noted it as a possible coincidence and moved on to the next engagement. On day 19, the quorum lost its first vessel. It happened at the edge of Mars's gravity well. A small human squadron, 6 ships, pulled a maneuver that the engagement model had not included because the model had calculated it as statistically suicidal. The lead human ship absorbed 2 full direct hits and kept moving. It should have broken apart. Materials it was built from should have failed under that kind of energy transfer. They didn't. The human ship drove directly into the formation center, released something the analysts argued later about exactly what it was, whether it was a weapon or a piece of the ship that had already broken loose. And 2 quorum vessels lost engine function simultaneously. In the confusion, the other 5 human ships picked them apart. 1 quorum vessel destroyed, 1 crippled and abandoned. 6 human ships, all destroyed in the subsequent response. The numbers still favored the quorum enormously. 1 vessel against 2 was not a crisis, but the human ship had kept moving after taking 2 direct hits. The engineers filed a report on human hull construction and were told that it would be reviewed when resources allowed. Fleet Commander Oran read the day 19 summary over his morning meal and felt, for the first time, something he did not recognize. He had been in command of military operations for 23 years. He had managed campaigns against species that were larger, species that were faster, species that had technology the quorum had never seen before. He had always operated from a foundation of confidence. That was not arrogance, it was simply the product of having the numbers on his side. The numbers were still on his side. He knew that. He kept the spreadsheet in front of him like a talisman. Quorum ships, 3,961. Human vessels, 41 minus losses. The ratio was not in question. The thing he didn't recognize was not fear of the ratio. It was the feeling of watching someone learn. He had watched species fight before. Most species, when outmatched, did one of 3 things. They kept fighting the same way until they ran out of ships, or they tried to, or they ran. Those were the 3 options the models contained. They were the 3 options that 200 species military history had produced. The humans were doing none of them. They were watching what worked against them, and then not doing that anymore. Every engagement produced new behavior. The tactics on day 19 were not the tactics from day 1. The tactics on day 25 would not be the tactics from day 19. They were not repeating themselves. In 23 years of military command, Oran had never encountered a species that could rewrite its own battlefield doctrine in the middle of a war in real time from a position of overwhelming disadvantage. He requested additional fleet assets, 300 more ships approved. Within hours, the math was still clean. He kept telling himself that Velsorin had not slept properly in 11 days. This was not because of the war. The war was happening in space, far away in Velsorin. It was happening around him, the way weather happens present. Significant, but not the thing directly in front of his face. The thing directly in front of his face was the data. Myra Eth had been reassigned to the research project officially now. She came in each morning with new sections of the human evolutionary record, processed, organized, flagged. She was precise and efficient, and she had begun developing the specific expression of someone who was beginning to understand something they didn't go looking for. She had the expression of a person opening a door and finding the room on the other side much larger than the house suggested it should be. Sorn knew the expression. He had been wearing it for 2 weeks. He called her into his office one morning and put the analysis on the shared screen. "Tell me what you see," he said. She looked at it. She had already seen it. She had compiled most of it herself, but she looked at it again in the way you look at something when you need to say it out loud. "The predator record," she said. "On Earth, every major predator the humans would have competed with, larger, faster, better armed by nature by significant margins." Sorn said, "By significant margins." She agreed. The megafauna, the large animals they hunted, some of them had hides that most species tools couldn't penetrate, speed that no human could match over short distances, the kinds of animals that by any reasonable assessment should have made a quick meal of something the size of a human and moved on. And yet, she said, and yet the megafauna were gone. Many of them gone directly following human expansion into their ranges. A pattern repeated across continent after continent, the same story told in bones and extinction dates. Humans arrived, and the large things died. Not because humans were stronger, not because they were faster, because of something the data kept gesturing at, and Velsorn kept not knowing the right word for persistence. Myra Eth said. Persistence, he agreed. It was a thin word for what the data described. The human hunting method, the one they had used for 2 million years before they developed agriculture, was endurance pursuit. You found an animal, you followed it. You followed it past the point where the animal was tired. You followed it past the point where any reasonable creature would stop following. You followed it until the animal's body gave out from exhaustion. And you walked up to it calmly and finished the thing. Not speed, not strength, not better weapons. Lasting, they were built to outlast. Velsorn said. He had said it before. He kept saying it because it kept being the sentence the data arrived at, no matter which direction he approached. From Myra Eth pulled up the psychological file, the stress response data. She had gone through the human medical literature, their own literature, their own scientists, findings about their own species, and found something that had made her sit very still for a long time when she first read it. The cortisol clearance rate, she said. He nodded. He had read it. For most species, sustained existential threat produces a stress hormone accumulation that compounds over time, the longer the threat continues, the less functional the organism becomes. It is a physiological ceiling. Eventually the body cannot maintain combat effectiveness under sustained pressure. Under 1-4 humans, the ceiling isn't there, Val Sorn said. The ceiling isn't there, she said. Under sustained existential threat, the human stress response spikes and then not just stabilizes, it produces secondary hormonal responses that increase pain suppression, increase muscular efficiency, increase problem-solving capacity. The more danger they are in, the more capable they become. The room was quiet. That's not a feature, Myra said. That's not just something that happens. That is a body that was built to function optimally in the worst possible conditions. That is millions of years of selection pressure for one specific outcome. Quote, survival under extreme violence, Vel Sorn said. She nodded. They both looked at the screen. Vel Sorn's private notes were open in a separate window. He had written a single line 3 days ago that he hadn't been able to move past. What do you call a species that gets stronger when you hurt it? He hadn't answered his own question yet. He wasn't sure the answer was a word he wanted to say out loud. He called Myra that evening, though he rarely called her outside office hours. She answered. She sounded like she had not been sleeping either. He told her he had been reading the pain tolerance data again. She said she knew. She had been reading it too, he said. The tolerance isn't just physical. It's not just that they can absorb physical damage without stopping. The psychological literature, their own psychologists writing about their own species, describe something they call post-traumatic adaptation, a documented tendency for humans who have survived extreme violence to reorganize their priorities, their relationships, their sense of purpose, to come out of the experience not broken, functional, sometimes by their own account, more functional than before. Myra was quiet for a moment. We've been calling their war a phase, she said. Yes, a thing they haven't grown out of yet. Yes, another quiet. How long have they been at war? Historically, the full record. Vel Sorn looked at his notes. He had written the number down and then put the page face down on his desk and left it there. He picked it up now, he told her. She made a sound, not a word, just a sound. Small and involuntary, the kind of person makes when the number is so large it stops feeling like a number. That's before language, she said. Yes. Before cities. Before anything we would classify as civilization. Yes, they were at war. Before they had words for what they were doing, before they had words for anything. Vel Sorn said, the weapons are the oldest artifacts in the human archaeological record, not tools for farming, not shelter, weapons. Myra said, I need to tell you something I found today. I was going to wait until morning, but I think you should hear it now. He waited. The social bonding data, the psychological research on human groups under sustained threat. Every other species we've cataloged. Extended conflict fractures, social bonds, extended violence fragments. Groups reduces cooperation. Produces the breakdown of whatever community structures existed before the conflict. For humans, she stopped. Started again. For humans, sustained collective threat does the opposite. It produces stronger bonding, more cooperation, greater social cohesion. They have a term for it, they call it. She stumbled on the translation. Brotherhood, Velsorn said. Comradry, they have many words for it. They generate new ones during every conflict. War doesn't break them apart, Myra Eth said, it holds them together. The line was quiet for a long time. Velsorn, she said, I think we need to file a formal report, not an addendum, not a personal research flag, a formal emergency submission to the council. He was already opening the submission form. On screen, subject line, he said. What should it say? Myra Eth thought. About it, we have made a fundamental error in classification, she said. He typed it, sent it, outside his window. The station moved silently through space and somewhere in the direction of the yellow star, the war continued to produce its daily numbers. The numbers still favored the quorum. But in the 22 days since the conflict began, human battle doctrine had changed 6 times. No other species in quorum history had changed doctrine once during active conflict. Velsorn turned off his screen, sat in the dark, thought about something following prey past the point where anything reasonable would stop. Thought about what that made the prey feel, thought about the fact that humanity had been the thing doing the following for 2 million years. He did not sleep well that night. He suspected he would not sleep well for quite some time. The council chamber had a particular smell when things were going badly, not a bad smell exactly, just the smell of recycled air that had been breathed in, rebreathed by too many anxious people over too many hours. Velsorn noticed it the moment he walked in. He had never noticed it before. In all his years of presenting in this room, he took that as a sign that things were in fact going badly. The 14 council members were in their seats. This was notable. Emergency sessions sometimes happened with absent representatives attending remotely. Everyone was present in person. That meant someone, somewhere in the hierarchy above Velsorn, had decided this conversation needed to happen in the same room. Iran was there too, which surprised Velsorn. Military commanders didn't usually attend scientific briefings, but Iran was in the far corner, arms crossed, looking at the data wall with the expression of a man who has been reading bad news for 3 days and is here to see if it gets worse. It was going to get worse. Velsorn began. He didn't start with conclusions. He had learned over 31 years that conclusions without foundations were just opinions. And in a room full of people who had their own opinions already, opinions started arguments. He started with the data, the oldest data first, the weapons. He put the image on the wall. Stone tools, 2 million years old, recovered from a site in what humans called Tanzania. He explained what they were: not farming tools, not construction tools, not anything that served the purpose of shelter or sustenance. They were designed to be held in one hand and used against something that was trying to get away or trying to get closer. The room was quiet. He kept going. He showed the megafauna data. He walked them through the pattern: humans expanding across continents, large animals vanishing from the fossil record in a timeline that matched the expansion almost perfectly. He was careful not to editorialize. He just showed them the dates and the pattern and let those two things sit together on the screen. Then he showed them the hunting method, the endurance pursuit, the biological profile, the shoulder joint, the pain tolerance, the cortisol response. He had visual aids He had laid them out specifically to build the picture one piece at a time, so the conclusion arrived naturally, so the council could feel themselves arriving at it rather than being told where to go. One of the council members, Representative Cale Vaughn of the Velkai, who had never once interrupted a briefing in 40 years of service, interrupted. "You're saying they were designed for this," she said. "I'm saying they evolved for this," Velsorin said, "which is, in the context of biology, the same thing." She sat back. He kept going. He talked about the psychological data, the stress response, the bonding under threat. He had graphs for these, not because graphs were necessary for understanding, but because in rooms like this one, graphs made things feel solid, real, like something that could be pointed at rather than just described. The graphs showed a species that became more dangerous under pressure, not because they were reckless, because they were times built times for it, in the same way that a deep-sea creature is built for pressure, not by choosing to adapt to the environment, but by being shaped over millions of years until the environment was the thing they were made for. He saved the social bonding data for last because it was the piece that had kept him awake. He explained it carefully. The fracturing effect that prolonged conflict had on every other species. They had cataloged the inverse human response, the fact that human groups under existential threat didn't collapse. They hardened. Then he told them something he hadn't put in the official submission, a personal observation, something he'd noticed in the human historical record while reading through 3 days ago. Every major human war in their recorded history had produced music, not just art, generally music. Specifically, songs made by soldiers in the middle of conflict, passed along and sung collectively, representing some need in the human organism to bind itself to the people around it through sound. The pattern appeared in every culture, every era, every major conflict in the human record, specific to human experience in a way that no other species showed. They made music to hold themselves together while they fought. He paused to let that sit. Oran from his corner said, "This is all very interesting. None of it changes the fleet numbers." Velsorin looked at him. "No," he said. "It doesn't, but the fleet numbers have changed." He switched the display. The new numbers were bad, not catastrophically bad. The ratio still favored the quorum, but the shape of the numbers was wrong in ways that the ratio didn't capture on its own. 30 days into the conflict, the quorum had committed 4,300 ships to the engagement. They had lost 71, damaged another 104. The human fleet had begun with 40 vessels. They had lost 37. Oran started to say something. Velsorin put up the next slide. The human fleet currently had 412 vessels. The room was quiet for a different reason now. They built them, one of the council members said. Not a question, just a person trying to confirm that what they were looking at was real. During active conflict, Velsorin said, while conducting ongoing engagements, absorbing losses, and rewriting battle doctrine at the same time they were doing all of that, they were constructing new vessels at a rate analysts initially considered impossible, and have since revised 4 times. The current projection suggests, he put up the third slide, that within 60 days, assuming current production rates hold, their fleet will number somewhere between 1,200 and 1,500 ships. Nobody said anything, Velsorin let the silence do its work. The doctrine changes. Council member said finally, they've changed tactics 6 times in 30 days. 7 times now, Velsorin said. As of yesterday morning. No species changes doctrine during active engagement. The cognitive load alone, they're not treating it as doctrine change, Myra Eth said. She was standing slightly behind Velsorin. To his right. She had not been expected to speak. But she spoke. Their military structure doesn't work the way ours does. It isn't top-down in the same way. Individual unit commanders have significant autonomy. When something stops working, the units that are still alive stop doing it and try something else, and then they communicate what worked to every other unit. The changes aren't ordered from the top, they emerge from the people who are actually in the engagements. The learning is happening everywhere at once. Another silence. That's not a military structure, one of the council members said. That's he didn't finish. Velsorin finished for him. It's more like an organism. The individual cells, the units, the soldiers respond to the environment. The response propagates, the whole adapts. And he paused. We have been fighting as if we were facing a military. We may be fighting something closer to an immune system. Iran from his corner was very still. Velsorin turned to the primary question the council would have, the one they'd been building toward since the briefing started. The question you're all holding, he said, is whether this is a phase, whether the human capacity for war is something they're passing through the way the assessment suggested, whether given sufficient external stability, it self-corrects. He looked at his notes. He looked up. It doesn't. One of the council members said, how confident are you in that assessment? Completely, Velsorin said. Original assessment said the aggression was culturally produced. The data does not support that. The aggression is biologically embedded at a depth that culture doesn't reach. Culture channels. It shapes the direction it goes, provides the context, but the capacity itself is not cultural, it's structural. It's in the bones and the muscles and the hormones and the psychological architecture. It is not a phase, it is the future, Representative Cale Vaughn said. Then what are we looking at? A species that evolved for war against the megafauna of their own planet. That was the original pressure. The megafauna are gone. The large predators are gone. The context that shaped them no longer exists. So what are they doing with that capacity now? Velsorin said, they're using it on each other. They always have, but they're also building, expanding. They directed the same capacity toward technology, toward exploration, toward construction, on a scale their planet's history had never seen before. They are not just a war species, they are, he stopped, found the right words, they are a drive species. Whatever they decide to do, they do with everything they have until it's done. War, science, building, music, they don't have a register for half effort. It's not in the architecture. The chamber was quiet for a long time. Iran spoke. His voice was steady, but there was something different in it now. Not fear. Iran was not a man who feared. Something adjacent to fear that didn't have a name yet. The fleet numbers, he said, 400 ships. Now 1,200 projected. If we commit sufficient additional force, they'll change doctrine again, Myra Eth said. They'll lose ships, they'll learn from The losses, they'll build more. You can break a human fleet, and they will learn specifically from how you broke it and not let you break the next one the same way. Then we commit overwhelming force enough that there is no next one, Velsorin said. How many ships would constitute overwhelming force against a species that gets stronger under sustained threat, against a species whose social bonds intensify under prolonged conflict, against a species whose entire history is the story of smaller, weaker things outlasting bigger, stronger ones? By simply refusing to stop, Oran had an answer. Velsorin could see him forming it, but the answer required a number. And the number, when Oran worked it out internally, was not a number, he said. Out loud, the council member who spoke was the oldest member present, a Lorenthi representative who had been in that seat for 60 years and had seen 4 different first contact failures in his tenure, and none of them like this. He said, "Is there a path to negotiation?" Velsorin said, "The human response to the opening diplomatic failure was to send a single man with still hands and no weapons to request a meeting. They are not a species that doesn't understand negotiation. They understand it extremely well. They also understand it as one of many tools. If we approach them from a position of continued aggression, they will continue to adapt and fight. If we approach from a position of search for the word acknowledgement of mutual standing, then yes, I believe they will negotiate, but I want to be clear about something. Whatever agreement we reach with humanity will not be because they need it. It will be because they choose it. There is a difference. Easy, we should not approach the table forgetting which side of that difference we're on." The chamber was quiet. Oren left without saying anything else. Oren gathered his materials. He walked out of the room. The corridor outside was cool and bright and smelled of nothing in particular. Myra Eth fell into step beside him. She didn't say anything for a while. Then, "Do you think they'll listen?" "Some of them," he said. "Enough of them." He thought about the fleet numbers, about the 7 doctrine changes in 30 days, about 400 ships where there had been 40. "I think," he said carefully, "that whether they listen or not is going to matter a great deal less than it would have 60 days ago." She thought about that, didn't respond. They walked down the corridor together in silence, which was the only sensible thing to do. The negotiation offer was sent on day 47. It took the Quorum Council 3 days of argument to agree on the wording, not because they disagreed about whether to offer it. By day 44, even the members who had approved the initial strike had stopped arguing for continued escalation, but because nobody in the Council's 400 years of diplomatic history had ever had to write a message like this one. Every negotiation offer the Quorum had ever extended had been written from a position of strength. The language of Quorum diplomacy was built on that foundation. Even the most generous offers, even the ones extended in genuine goodwill, had the architecture of strength underneath them, a certain weight to the sentences, a certain direction of authority. The drafters kept writing it that way, keep reviewing the draft and feeling something wrong in it, scrapping it and starting again. On the 4th attempt, an aide who had been quiet through the entire process suggested, carefully, that perhaps they were writing the wrong kind of offer. "We keep writing it as though we are offering them something," she said. "Perhaps we should write it as though we are asking, the room considered this. The fifth draft was shorter than any previous quorum. Diplomatic communication, it said in plain language that the conflict had not gone as anticipated, that the quorum believed a negotiated resolution would be better for both parties than continued engagement, and that they were prepared to discuss terms at a time and location of humanity's choosing. It did not offer anything it asked. The message was sent. 6 days of silence followed. This was different from the first silence. The first silence after the lunar strike had been 22 hours of hidden, furious activity. The quorum could see the communication traffic, even if they couldn't decode it. This silence was quieter. The traffic was there, but lower, calmer. On the quorum station, the silence felt like waiting for a verdict. Vels Oren used the 6 days to finish his full report, not the emergency submission that had been filed and presented. The complete document, the one that started at the beginning of human evolutionary history and followed the line all the way to the present day. He was a thorough man. He had always written thorough reports, but this one he wrote slowly, because writing it slowly meant he had to think about each piece of the record individually, and thinking about each piece individually meant he kept arriving at the same conclusion from different directions. He was on the 43rd page when Myra Eth came into his office without knocking, which she had never done before. She put a data pad on his desk. He looked at it. It was a cultural analysis. She had been running it quietly for 2 weeks alongside his biological work, a parallel track neither of them had discussed formally. He picked it up and read. She had been looking at human mythology, the stories they told about themselves, the oldest stories, the ones that predated recorded history, reconstructed through oral tradition, research, and comparative mythology studies, the ones that showed up in slightly different shapes across every isolated human culture on every continent, every intelligent species. The quorum had cataloged, had origin myth stories about where they came from and what they were meant to be. The earth told a story about emerging from darkness into light. The Velkai had a creation myth centered on harmony, on the universe finding balance. The Lorenzi, the quorum's oldest founding species, had an origin story about two forces becoming one. Every species had some version of paradise at the beginning, something whole and good that defined what they were supposed to be before the complications arrived. Myra Eth had gone through every major human culture's origin mythology. None of them started with paradise. Every one of them started with a struggle, a conflict, a trial that had to be survived. The earliest human heroes were not peaceful figures who maintained harmony. They were figures who endured, figures who fought, figures who went into the dark and came back from it changed, carrying something hard won. The human concept of a good life was not a life without difficulty. It was a life that had survived difficulty and been shaped by it. The human concept of a worthy person was not someone who had avoided the fire. It was someone who had walked through it. This was not a cultural value they had developed. It was the oldest story. They had the story they told before. They had writing before they had cities, before they had agriculture, before they had almost anything at all. They had already decided that the highest thing a person could be was someone who had faced something terrible and kept going. Vels Oren read the analysis twice, then he set it down and looked at the wall for a long time. They didn't inherit this, Myra Eth said. The mythology didn't create the value created the mythology. You don't tell stories like these unless the stories already match. Something in you, he said. They dreamed of it before they had the neurology to dream of anything else. She didn't answer. The sentence didn't need an answer. He turned back to his report. He wrote one new line at the top before the introduction, before the methodology, before anything else. He wrote, "We classified their war as a phase." He wrote, "We were wrong about what it was. A phase of." Then he stopped and didn't write anything else for a while. The response came on day 6. It was brief. A location, a station at the edge of the solar system, neutral ground by anyone's definition, a time, a list of 3 names, the human representatives who would attend. The first name on the list was Commander Daniel Asse, Terraceville. Read the list and thought about his still hands. She had thought about them frequently over the past 47 days, in the background of everything else, in the way you keep returning to an image that your brain filed as significant before. You understood why. She understood now. She had seen many people under pressure. She had sat across from heads of state, military commanders, revolutionaries, people who had everything at stake. Under enough pressure, everyone moved. That was not weakness, it was biology. It was the body expressing what the mind was too disciplined to show. Asse's hands had not moved, not because he wasn't afraid. She suspected Commander Asse understood fear extremely well, but because somewhere in the architecture of how he was built, the fear didn't go to his hands, it went somewhere else. It went into the still, total attention. He gave every word she said. It went into the way his eyes moved, not quickly, not nervously, but with the specific thoroughness of something, assessing the way she thought. A hunter assesses a situation. She had not known that was what she was seeing at the time. She was the quorum's best diplomat. She was going to the meeting. She had requested to lead it herself. The meeting lasted 9 hours. Vels Oren was not there. He received the summary the next morning, a 20-page document that he read in 2 hours and then read again. Terms were not what he had expected. He had braced for punishing demands. He had braced for territorial claims, for reparations, for the kinds of conditions that a losing party accepts because they have no other option. He had seen other negotiations that followed military conflicts. The winner's terms always reflected the gap in power, always. It was nearly a mathematical relationship. Asse's terms did not do this. The quorum retained full sovereignty. No territory changed hands. No reparations were demanded for the lunar strike, which had been objectively an act of aggression against a species that had not yet attacked them. The quorum would contribute resources to rebuilding human vessels lost in the conflict, a concession but a modest one, framed as a gesture of good faith rather than an obligation. In return, humanity received a permanent seat on the Quorum Council, equal standing to the founding species, full access to quorum technology, treaty, networks, and diplomatic systems, and one additional term, stated plainly, the simplest language of the document: any act of aggression against humanity by any quorum member species or allied entity would be treated as an act of aggression against the quorum itself. Protection Guaranteed, Velsorin read this line 3 times. He understood it the third time. They weren't angry. That was the thing. He had expected the humans to be angry. He had expected them to carry into that negotiation room the weight of a species that had been struck without warning, that had lost ships and people, that had spent 47 days fighting something vastly larger than itself. He had expected that weight to arrive in the form of demands, of anger of the specific kind of ferocity that a small thing shows when it has proven it can survive a large thing. They weren't angry, they were done, and they knew the difference. Anger would have said, "You will pay for this." What they said instead was, "This will not happen again." Not a punishment, a perimeter, a wall they were drawing around themselves and naming the cost of crossing it. Soren sat with this for a long time. Then he went back to his report. He finished it 4 days later. The last section was the hardest to write, not because the data was unclear. The data had been clear for weeks. Because, putting it plainly, required saying something that the quorum's entire scientific and diplomatic framework had no category for. He wrote it anyway. He wrote about the archaeological record, the tools that came before everything else. He wrote about the mythology, using Myra Et's analysis, citing her work carefully. He wrote about the biology and the psychology and the stress response and the social bonding and all of it, all the pieces assembled in order. And then at the end he wrote the conclusion: we approach this species with a framework built on a single assumption, that intelligence trends toward peace, that given sufficient development, sufficient stability, sufficient time, the violent phase of a civilization's growth gives way to something calmer, something more suited to the long work of coexistence. This framework is correct for every species we have encountered. It is incorrect for humanity, not because humanity is incapable of coexistence. The negotiation record demonstrates they are not only capable of it, but will choose it when approached with honesty and genuine respect. The error was in the premise. We assumed that in humanity, as in all other species we know, the drive toward peace was the core, and the capacity for war was a layer on top, a phase, a vestige, something the deeper self was moving away from. The evidence suggests the opposite. The peace is genuine, the creativity is genuine, the art and the music and the love and the community are genuine, but underneath all of it, older than all of it, more deeply embedded than any of it, is something that was shaped by 2 million years of being smaller and slower and weaker than the things that wanted to kill it, something that learned in that time that the only answer to a thing that wants to kill you is to outlast it. We did not encounter a civilization that had not yet grown past its war. We encountered a civilization that had grown into everything else while keeping its war, like a tree that grows around a stone. The stone is still there. It will always be there. The appropriate response is not fear. The appropriate response is to remember which side of the perimeter you are on. He saved the document, submitted it, marked it for full council distribution. Then he turned off his screen. On Earth, a few weeks after the treaty was signed, a child played in a yard outside a house in a city that had spent 47 days preparing for a war that looked nothing like any war it had prepared for. The child was small, maybe 7 years old, playing the way children play, without an Audience without a point, just using the world in front of them as material. She picked up a stick. She pointed it at something in the yard, a bird maybe. Shadow, something that moved. She made a sound with her mouth. An explosion sound. The specific sound children made in every culture, on every continent, across the entire human historic record as old as childhood itself. She laughed, the stick dropped, she ran across the yard after something else. Entirely, already done with the game. Already somewhere new, a quorum. Observation drone recorded the moment. It was a passive drone, routine coverage. The kind maintained in populated areas. Across all quorum monitored worlds. Footage went up automatically to the General Archive. Nobody flagged it for review. Nobody wrote a report on it. It sat in the archive alongside 10,000 other pieces of routine footage from that day, unlabeled, unremarkable. In his office, Velsorin was already working on his next file. A new species, a water world 3 stars over. Preliminary surveys suggested they were peaceful, slow-moving, highly communal. No evidence of organized conflict in their entire recorded history. He started reading. He did not know at that moment that Myra Etz had seen the drone footage, that she had pulled it up while going through the day's archive and watched it twice, that she had sat with it for a long time, that she had written a single line in her private notes and then closed the file and not opened it again. The line said they were playing at it before they understood what it was for. She did not submit it. Some things you understand, and understanding them is enough, and saying them out loud only makes the room colder. She went home. The station turned through space, and somewhere in the direction of a yellow star on a planet that had spent the last 2 months building faster than anyone had thought possible, a species that had been smaller and slower and weaker than everything that wanted to kill it for 2 million years, looked up at the stars and smiled and went back to work.